This was the US envoy last week after she announced Washington's support for 2 permanent seats for Africa on a reformed UN Security Council, but critically without veto power.
We have veto power as well, and none of the permanent members want to give up their veto power, including us. I'm being honest about that. We don't want to give up our veto power, and we do think if we expand that veto power across the board, it will make the council more dysfunctional.
Fast forward a few days to a briefing by the ambassador previewing the US priorities for the upcoming General Assembly's high-level week, and this question.
Why retain something you yourself have described as creating dysfunction? What purpose does the veto hold beyond giving countries a mechanism that often blocks broad consensus in the Council, most notably on the Middle East file, the DPRK, and Ukraine, some of the most intractable issues that have been before this Council? What purpose does this veto serve?
The veto power was created when the council was created. And yes, we've had some serious issues with the use of the veto, because we use the veto on issues, all of us, that are of import to us. And so while I understand why other countries think the veto is dysfunctional, so I acknowledge their understanding that the veto is dysfunctional, and I acknowledge that we're not prepared to give up the veto, but countries can't make that happen until they're sitting in a permanent seat. So my argument to countries is, don't demand what you think is dysfunctional, demand to work within the system to figure out how to change that. And I don't know how to make that change happen, but I do think increasing the number of permanent seats on the council will make the council more inclusive. It will bring added voices to how the council functions, and it will bring additional regional interest to the table. So yes, we have made a decision, like others, that we're not ready to give up on our veto power, but we're willing to listen to what others have to say on that, and we'll see where it carries us.
What's your view? The ambassador was then first pressed on Washington's view of Russia's use of the veto on the Ukraine file.
It's been a problem. You have a country, a permanent member of the Security Council, who has broken every single tenet of the charter by invading a neighbor, actually compromising the sovereignty of that country and the borders of that country. And that country sits on the Security Council with a veto. So it is problematic.
Against?
And then on the US use of the veto on the Palestinian file, most notably the ongoing war in Gaza. And the response was illuminating and unapologetic.
We use our veto to promote the interests of the US government. And that's how we've used that veto consistently over many, many years in the council. And yes, people think it leads to dysfunction. But for us, it is power that we have, and we do use that power. I'm not going to make any excuses for it. It is something that is within the toolbox of things that we can bring to the table in the Security Council. And let me be clear on the issues related to the Middle East. We want to see peace, and that's what President Biden has worked for.
Security Council reform continues to be under the purview of the intergovernmental negotiations in the UN General Assembly. And while it's unclear how the US position as expressed here will play itself out in the IGN negotiations, that process is moving at a snail's pace, with the prospect of a final formulation for a reformed Security Council not expected anytime soon. Despite the avalanche of support and urgency we'll hear from heads of state and government when they speak at the UN next week. The common position of the African Union on reform, contained in the Eswatini Consensus, calls for at least 2 permanent seats for the continent, and that as long as the veto exists as a matter of common justice, it should be made available to all permanent members, which, at least according to the United States, appears to be a pipe dream. Sherwin Ricebees, SABC News, New York.